With the death of Julius Caesar, we come now to the essentially final incident of the Roman Republic, and it's in fact the incident that officially did terminate the Roman Republic, even though in practical consideration, the Republic could be considered to continue until 31 down to 27 BC, when Octavian took over and became Emperor Augustus. But this official three-way arrangement of power, referred to as the Second Triumvirate today, is in fact what legally does end the Republic. The main point here is that in the government of the Republic, consuls and the Senate were supposed to hold the highest ranks of power. The consuls were elected, and the senators were generally appointed by consuls once they were finished with office, or by the Senate itself bringing in new members of its body. However, with the Second Triumvirate, three gentlemen listed here all took powers that were considered superior to consular power by agreement with the Senate. The term for that is this. Imperium Maius, which means greater command. Imperium Maius is a essentially jury-rigged term used by the Senate and eventually applied to Octavian himself, essentially saying that one official's imperium is greater than everybody else's. So although the highest rank of imperium on a standing basis was supposed to be the consuls, represented by the 12 lictors that were assigned to them in the original days of the kings, Imperium Maius assures that anybody granted this level of imperium could pass legislation and take other action that would superimpose itself on the authority of the consuls. The three members of the Second Triumvirate are the adopted son of the now deceased Julius Caesar, Octavian, later Augustus, this other gentleman named Lepidus, a relatively wealthy politician, and then Mark Antony. And Mark Antony is Caesar's chief lieutenant, the one who's well known for Friends, Romans, Countrymen, Lend Me Your Ears, from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. These three were granted formal powers by the Senate by a law called Lex Titia, L-E-X. And that it's that official pronouncement of power by the Senate onto them that is considered to essentially end the Republic for all intents and purposes, even though that wasn't necessarily evident immediately at 43 BC. One of the agreements that these three politicians made amongst each other was that each one could select some member of the Roman population, especially the Roman officials, to be essentially removed. Mark Antony's choice was Cicero, because Cicero had denounced Antony quite fiercely in a series of 14 speeches that were essentially similar to Demosthenes' Philippics, denouncing Philip of Macedon, and so they're also referred to as Philippics. But they in fact went after Mark Antony, especially the second one, which was quite severe. So due to Cicero's opposition to Mark Antony, he chose Cicero to be executed, and Plutarch gives a vivid description of Cicero and his brother being chased in their chariots by Roman officials trying to catch them, and finally Cicero stuck at a river in his chariot, finally realizing that the game was up, sticking his head out the window and having his head chopped off, and that was the end of Cicero in 43 BC. So the Second Triumvirate lasted for 10 years, but like its informal predecessor, the First Triumvirate, it was not without quite a bit of instability along the way. The first problem was that Octavian and Antony essentially had an unequal position in relation to Lepidus. And the two of them, even though they included Lepidus in the group, essentially ended up really trying to share money, power, and such between each other, and squeezing out Lepidus. So Lepidus, who ended up essentially confined to the North African province and the islands nearby, such as Sicily, ended up really getting the short end of the stick in this arrangement. So that's one thing that has ominous repercussions for later. Second problem is that Octavian was assigned the entire Western Republic at that point, while Mark Antony headed east to the Black Sea region. It was while he was up in the Black Sea area that he came to encounter Cleopatra, who was on herself a political journey at that time. One thing led to another. Three illegitimate sons were born to Mark Antony, all of them named Ptolemy because Cleopatra was the pharaoh belonging to the Ptolemy family, and in fact turned out to be the final pharaoh of the Ptolemies, who themselves were the final dynasty of Egypt before it became a Roman province in the late kingdom. So we have three sons of Mark Antony who, because of his political and military position under Caesar, all of whom could potentially become possible contenders for Roman rule, especially the eldest of the three, named Ptolemus Philadelphus. So this suddenly complicated the picture enormously for Octavian and the city of Rome itself, because now Mark Antony, who was supposed to be representing the interests of Rome outside, now all of a sudden has this liaison that he's not supposed to have with a foreign queen, and now has children who do not in fact have proper marital arrangement, so they're bastard children, and now all of a sudden they could potentially vie for Roman power. So this isn't good. Initially, however, the two of them stayed more or less on the same page, Octavian and Antony. And in 37 BC, when it was time to renew the Republic, 38 BC down into 37 BC, Octavian and Antony started dividing most of the tasks and privileges between each other, and the effect was to squeeze out Lepidus. Now, there was another fellow in the picture here that I've not yet put up on the board. I will now add him. And this is Sextus Pompeius, who is the son of Pompey the Great. He also was attempting to get in on this arrangement, and when Lepidus found himself receiving insufficient proper representation in 38 down to 37 BC, he and Sextus Pompeius ended up teaming up. Now, Sextus Pompeius, a rather violent-minded individual, who, as we say, was the son of Pompey the Great, but was unable to get himself into the top ranks, had teamed up with pirates. And Lepidus and Sextus apparently teamed up together, and in 37 down to 36 BC, they seized the island of Sicily. Finally, in 36 BC, however, Octavian and Antony teamed up together in order to get rid of Sextus. Octavian, of course, did most of the work since this was his part of the world. And in 36 BC, at the Battle of Naupactus, Sextus Pompeius was defeated and shortly after killed. And because Lepidus was now openly in league with Sextus, Lepidus ended up being expelled from the Second Triumvirate, effectively. Essentially, Lepidus was assigned North Africa now as his permanent province, and essentially was relegated there, and he sort of disappears from the scene after that. So now the leftover remains of the Second Triumvirate are between Octavian and Antony themselves. Relations would continue to deteriorate quickly between these two, especially because just as Caesar and Pompey had solidified their pact with a marriage, that is, of Pompey and Caesar's daughter Julia, so now we have Octavian's sister Octavia, who is married in this formal political arrangement to Mark Antony. But regrettably, Octavia was a rather homely lady, and apparently not at all a match for Cleopatra. So when Antony took up with Cleopatra, not only was he essentially committing a kind of bigamous arrangement, even though in fact the marriage could never be consummated with Cleopatra, but also he was violating the terms of the Triumvirate. And finally, to make it worse still, he refused to grant a divorce to Octavia. So finally, with that and other things going wrong, finally Octavian approached the Senate, had himself once again given the dictatorial power. The Senate passed the SCU, and now Octavian had Mark Antony declared public enemy. So it sort of follows the same course as the previous Triumvirate. After further campaigns, Octavian was finally able to catch Mark Antony in Greece, and at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, which is the western coast of the northern section of Greece, Octavian was finally able to defeat Antony's forces. Antony himself did, again, much the same as Pompey the Great before him. He fled to Egypt, and when he arrived at the shores of Egypt and saw that he could not escape, because he was going to be chased down, he committed suicide on the shores of Egypt. And when Cleopatra heard about his death, she famously used a snake, some kind of a snake, maybe a cobra, probably not an asp, that she applied to her breast, and that took care of Cleopatra also in 30 BC. With that, that clears the way completely for Octavian. One point I should insert is that when Octavian and Antony had been teamed up properly, one of their first acts was to pursue the assassins of Julius Caesar, Brutus and Cassius. Brutus, by the way, being the descendant of the original Brutus who started the Republic in the first place. And the two of them were kind of, again, similarly to Pompey, chased to Greece, and they were caught at Philippi in 42 BC, and it was that battle in which we see the end of Brutus and Cassius. So their elimination earlier, and now Mark Antony's elimination later, finally clears the way completely for Octavian to have complete power. This also concludes the Republican portion of the Roman history series of these videos. It also therefore concludes the series of videos on history that precede the midterm exam. So hereafter, you're going to be getting ready for your midterm exam, and when we return after the midterm exam to the history series, we will start talking about the empire, first with Octavian becoming Augustus, and then the four subsequent Julio-Claudian emperors.